Hello, Professor Cochrane. I'm Brenda Wingfield. I'm Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Natural and Agricultural Sciences at the University of Pretoria. Managing academics is a bit like herding cats, and the way in which I try and do that is to put milk on the table, and you explain to us very nicely the milk that you're putting on the table to incentivize the academics at QUT to, in actual fact, put these e-prints onto the website. Could you unpack that process and explain to us exactly how you do it? Because this sounds like rather an interesting way of operating.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I should say that the word mandate at a university doesn't have quite the same force as the word mandate in some other settings. Of course, if someone doesn't comply with the university policy, there are two options. One is to say, look, this is a university policy and it must be complied with. You've got 3 weeks. That doesn't always work. And the other is to say that we will come back and talk about this in a short time. And when the implementation period was underway at QUT, guidance was sought from me about how to have those conversations. I said, if you encounter some kind of objection to doing this which doesn't seem understandable or reasonable, but seems to be intractable, move on, because what we need to do is build this. And what's happened is some people have come back to it and have seen the results for their colleagues. It will always be the case that if we're talking about research and research output, and you can see that a particular behaviour will lead to greater recognition, greater reward, such as the examples that I gave, of course that will be the most compelling argument in the long run. Do I see a hard edge to any of this? It's possible, but I wouldn't conduct a conversation of that kind without deep discussion with the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research, whose responsibility is to lead the research activity of the university. Obviously he's extremely supportive of this and some other things that we've been doing. So there's no simple answer, but I think the feedback to folk about how widely they were being read in that, it's so gratifying, and it's different to your experience with journal publication, where you might get a thing called citation counts, but it's much later. It's at a different time. And I think that's been probably a really important part of the relative success at QUT. But I might say we don't have 100% coverage. It's around 70.
I'm Liam Borkstrom, an assistant lecturer in publishing at the University of Pretoria. And I'd like to know, you showed a Google search earlier and the success of an article that came up. And that seems to be something that's been working more lately, where you're finding things on a standard web search rather than a scholar search. And I can imagine that only working because an institutional repository might be more easily searchable. So I'd like to know, have you found which articles published via the Green Road or the Gold Road, how are they more easily discoverable? Which ones are more easily discoverable?
The short answer is no, we haven't done that work. As we go on, there's all sorts of interesting questions, and that's one of them. So could we do that comparison? I'd like to do that. We also will be tracking some of the things that I showed you over a longer period and with more people. So the short answer is no, we haven't done that comparison. Can I also say that there's a quite important role to be played in thinking about the metadata that describe the material that goes into the repository. And there was one period, I think it was up to about the end of 2007, where the Google results with a straight Google, so not Google Scholar, but a straight Google search, were terrific. We were getting quite interesting hit rates. And then Google changed their algorithm and it didn't happen anymore like that. But we couldn't write to Google and say, hey, we just had to note what was happening and then figure out how to respond to what we understood to be the changes. And it's not the first game, you know, it's not the first priority. It's just nice when you see it happen, especially if you've had 500,000 or 1 million hits in response to a search.
Prof, I would like to know, what is the perception of other higher education institutions in Australia in terms of your openness on the one hand side, and how is it perceived by government and other funding agencies within your country?
There's been quite a bit of interest. ANU had a lot of interaction with us before they launched their policy last year. Macquarie University, led by its Vice-Chancellor, became interested in this when they started to wonder if there was a correlation between other metrics showing that we were growing much faster than average, and what we had done in this domain. And so they introduced a similar policy. But I think that what happens is that unless, and this is true with all sorts of things in universities, unless there's an engagement by the leadership at the level of Deputy Vice-Chancellor or Vice Principal, Vice President in the case of the US, unless there's an engagement there, what can happen is that you introduce a policy which doesn't get an endorsement and a kind of an ongoing activity of leadership that then shows people where the milk is on the table, to use the previous reference. And I think that has happened in some of the other universities in Australia, just the same as it's happened elsewhere. What's interesting is to see a change suddenly, as in the case of the Harvard University Science and Arts mandate, or the MIT one, or UCL, or Imperial College, and a number of other places. The Vice-Chancellor, or Rector as he's called at the University of Liège in Francophone Belgium, is a very committed leader of open access. Basically, the direction on it came from his office. And he's a virologist, by the way. That's his discipline background. And when we finally met a couple of years ago, he said to me that he can't understand why people don't see that the old business model is the old business model. It's appropriate to the print age, it's not where we are now, and the way we do things needs to be much more connected and much more rapid in terms of the exposure of the quality research. In terms of government, the government can be a little bit schizophrenic. I say that in a nice way. The government can have a part of its policy arm which is absolutely committed to maximum exposure of the country's scientific and social scientific research paid for by the taxpayer. Absolutely clear. This must happen. And it will develop a thing called a research accessibility framework, which came out a few years ago. And it will develop policy and put pressure on its research funding councils, which are independent bodies, about these matters. At the same time, it can generate a research competition in the country, a ratings competition, which absolutely depends on the status quo of publishing as the marker of quality, what I was talking about before. And so that has a very reinforcing effect on a more closed, or a potentially more closed approach. As I say, I think those things don't necessarily have to exclude each other. And when it comes to the range of activities of a national government, this is not the only arena where one area of government seems to say something that isn't quite aligned with another area. But in general, funders, government, some thinking in research institutes about the value of rapid diffusion and rapid exposure is a rising, I think it's an opinion of rising strength and support. And so it finds its way into policy thinking as time goes by.